Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is your Pastor Jeff Short and your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that I think is important because a lot of Christians don't seem to understand how to process the situation where church leaders, pastors, evangelists, clergy of all types, they don't know how to process when a church leader or pastor or evangelist falls into error or sin or immorality or foolishness. They don't know how to deal and think through these situations properly because a lot of times there's a lot of emotionalism involved in the response. There's a lot of exaggerated language and talk, and there's just all kinds of incorrect ways of processing a problem like this. We do have to process these problems. It's a lot better to talk about these problems because we need to learn how to, in a Christian way, in a biblical way, deal with problems that come up in the church and Christianity and not sweep them under the rug. There are people and there are organizations who like to sweep things under the rug, and they do that for public relations and marketing purposes. There are churches that like to keep things under wraps. They like to hush-hush about anything that would hurt their, quote, brand. They're thinking very worldly in this regard. Now, in the Bible, it says that if someone sins, they should be publicly rebuked. If a leader sins, if a pastor sins, they should be publicly rebuked. And in Christianity, there is a process for that. If you've done something wrong, if you've said something foolish, if you need to be rebuked, then you are rebuked by the church. You confess your sin or your foolishness or whatever the fault was, and you repent of it and then move on. And you don't dwell on it, but you get it done and processed in the right way. Well, we're seeing all kinds of problems with how Christians are processing the Michael Brown situation. This is a well-known biblical teacher, leader, especially in the more charismatic and Pentecostal branch of Christianity. He is an apologist, defending the faith against all kinds of skeptics, atheists, false religions, all kinds of cults, and he's done a really good job in that regard, especially outreach to the Jewish people, and talked to many rabbis and debated them over passages like Isaiah 53 and so forth. Done a lot of good. He also has done a very good work in teaching younger people, students, to go on the mission field and get into ministry. And he has a Line of Fire broadcast on the internet and radio that he has done every day for years, and just is not afraid to tackle really some of the tough questions. Well, it has been revealed that some 20-some years ago, when he was director of the so-called Fire School of Ministry, which is a school that came out of a revival, I guess, down in Florida, and students would come from all different parts of the country, and they took classes and courses, and some of them went on to be mission field workers and others into churches, and it was more of a Bible training school where young people would come. Well, there have been accusations over the last year or so that there were a couple instances where he crossed the line in his relationships or his friendships with women. There were two instances where, for example, there was a younger woman in her 20s, early 20s, and then there was an older woman in her middle ages, 40-something, and he had crossed boundaries. He had become overly familiar with them and overly casual in his showing affection to them and friendship with them. The younger woman, it's reported, he would do things like let her sit on his lap, which is totally out of bounds for a married man like Michael Brown. And he would kiss her on the cheek and sometimes even on the lips. It was seen. He would slap her on the rear end. as she'd leave the office or whatever. She was an assistant or office assistant or someone connected with the office there in Florida where this fire school of ministry took place. And so and then there was the middle-aged woman that it's reported that there were some almost pornographic phone calls that were made and conversations between Brown and this woman. We're not quite sure exactly the extent of that, but that was reported. And so he definitely crossed boundaries. Now, he did a response to this, and he said, while there was a crossing boundaries with relationships and emotional connection and that, he said there was never adultery, there was never a sexual component to this. And so he thought that this was all settled 20 years ago when these two women, the younger woman confronted him, and then the older woman's husband confronted Brown. And so it was all dealt with, he says. But the problem is a lot of the people who had been involved in the fire school of ministry were upset that Brown hadn't been more forthcoming. He didn't make any public statements at the time, 20-some years ago. He just kind of swept it under the rug. And so they're very hurt and resentful and angry at him that he would carry on this way, crossing these boundaries and being someone who was leading this school with very strict standards. And so he was violating them as a hypocrite, but he then wasn't having to give an account of that. He never had to pay any price for that. It was all kept under secret. And finally, some of the details came out. Now, people are angry of this hypocrisy. They're upset that here was the leader supposed to be leading this school, and he wasn't even practicing what he preached. And so they're resentful of him for holding all of this information back and not confessing it and dealing with it at the time in a public manner. Again, the Bible talks about if someone falls into a sin, they need to be rebuked publicly so that everyone can learn. And it looks like Michael Brown didn't follow that, and so he wanted to try to keep his good name and reputation as a leader, and he didn't want to embarrass himself and pay the consequences for his foolishness. And there's no question that he would know that crossing these lines and acting in that inappropriate way is wrong. He would know that as a pastor. He's taught other people that these kinds of crossing of boundaries are wrong. And surely he would know himself that this was wrong, but somehow or another it applied to others, but not him. So, practice it. Listen to what I say, but not what I do, kind of a thing. So yes, there were definitely hypocrisy was involved here, and there was definitely an effort on his part to minimize and do damage control and keep this quiet so that he didn't have to suffer any consequences. Now, I can understand why people are angry and upset, especially people connected with that school, and they want to see him acknowledge and confess his sins and to do so in a public, humiliating way. I can understand that. But that does not mean that you're allowed to just try to pin everything on this guy and to try to go to extremes to get him to suffer and to pay back and to really punish him. It is not valid for Christians to try to go after him and bring charges against him that are unfair. And so I want to go through a number of different ways that Christians are doing wrong in approaching this whole problem with Dr. Michael Brown and his situation. The first problem is they're using extreme and inflammatory language to describe his activities of 20 years ago. For example, there are podcasters and people involved with reporting on Christian news and dealing with issues in the Christian body of Christ who are calling what he did sexual abuse. Some are even going so far as talking about sexual assault, and they're saying what his activity was grooming, sexual grooming. They're talking in terms of clergy sexual abuse. They're talking in terms of the people, these women, these two women, the younger woman and the older woman, are survivors, victims. And they're talking about Dr. Michael Brown as a sexual predator, just using totally inflammatory and excessive language and vocabulary. And this is wrong. This is wrong. Based on everything that we know of the situation back 20-some years ago, around 2001, I guess it was, based on everything we know, he is not a sexual abuser. He's not a sexual assault person. He's not a predator. And these women, as far as we know, they were not forced to interact with Dr. Michael Brown in these inappropriate ways. They chose to do that. They voluntarily, of their own free will and agency, chose to be in a relationship with this Michael Brown. And they crossed the lines along with Michael Brown. So they're not victims, except in the sense that they're victims of their own foolishness, just like Michael Brown is a victim of his own foolishness. If he has to pay a foolish price, then he has to pay it because of his gross mishandling of these relationships. Every adult Christian married man knows that you can't act toward a female in ways that you might be able to act when you were single. If Michael Brown were single and this 20-year-old woman was helping him in the office and he was in a relationship with her, he could kiss her and hold her hand and do all kinds of things. But he's a married man and she's a single woman and he can't do that. Everyone knows that. And the same way with this woman, this married woman in her mid-40s, in relating to Michael Brown, she knew that you're not supposed to talk to a man that's not your husband in the ways she did to Michael Brown, or to get emotionally attached to another man the way she did with Michael Brown. So they're not victims in the sense that you would have a child a victim of a sexual assault, like in the Roman Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal that happened in the early 2000s, where these were children, these were minors, these were people that had not grown up yet. They didn't have the ability to make choices on their own. And so they are completely victims. They're survivors. Yes, you can use that language with them, but not with these women. These were adult women. So, like it or not, I mean, this is inappropriate relationships taking place, but there was not the victim-predator relationship like in the children's sexual assault cases. So we shouldn't use that language. And if you use that language, shame on you, because you're reading into the story that something that's not there. So that's not fair. We have to stop using this kind of inflammatory, excessive language, extreme language, to describe the situation that Michael Brown finds himself in. Another thing is that we need to listen to the different testimonies that come in, but we also have to remember, if this were a courtroom or if this were a trial and you were listening to testimony, the judge would say to the jury, hey, listen to the testimony, but don't just believe everything you hear on the face of it. Listen to what they're saying. Try to determine if you think they're telling the truth. And then also listen to the cross-examination. There's cross-examination. So somebody gives testimony, somebody gives evidence for something, and then the other lawyer on the other side cross-examines them. In other words, probes and asks them questions and seeing if their statements are consistent. Because after all, people can be mistaken. They can think they saw something or think they heard something, or their mind and their memory can reconstruct a situation in a different way incorrectly. Or they can actually be outright lying in some form. Or they could have been talking to somebody else about this situation and confused what the conversation that they heard from somebody else and incorporate that in their testimony. So there's all kinds of things that have to take place before a jury will actually say, okay, I believe this testimony, because there's a lot that can happen in people's minds after, decades of their memories and what they've read and what they've heard and what they've seen. And so it's not a case where you can just take someone's testimony, let them give it, and say, see, based on this testimony, Brown did this and Brown did that. You have to sift and sort, and you have to use your mind, and you have to think, okay, was that person credible? Are they a solid, sound, truthful testimony? Or is this person trying to get somebody? Or are they angry and so they're going to say things in the worst possible light, or they're going to describe things, or are they going to add their own? Are they going to add their own conclusions to what they saw or heard? For example, there was a testimony by the husband of this middle-aged woman, one of the women that Brown had inappropriately crossed the line with relationally. And he said that Brown was calling his wife and wanting to meet up with her alone. And so a lot of Christians are taking that statement by this husband, this anonymous husband. We don't know the husband's name. We don't know his credibility. We don't know his background, but he claims that Brown was calling his wife and wanting to meet up with her alone. And these Christians on these podcasts and these Christians thinking about this are saying, well, we all know what he wanted to meet up with her about. He wanted to take her to a hotel, or he wanted to have sex, or he wanted to have an adulterous affair. And I'm thinking, wait, stop. We don't know what the nature of the invitation to meet with her. We already have evidence that he bounced ideas off her as far as ministry ideas and concepts and theological ideas. And there definitely was an element of Brown seeking after her counsel, but meeting with this woman alone doesn't necessarily mean that he wanted to have an adulterous relationship with her. So saying that we know for sure that's what his intention was, that's false. Because we're trying to read his mind. We're trying to read his motives. We're trying to ascribe motives and intentions to him, which is not legitimate. You can't do that. You have to base your understanding of the situation on the facts. And to say, well, because he wanted to meet with this woman alone, that meant he wanted to have adultery with her. No. That's a conclusion. And then some people say, well, you can just put two and two together. Well, if there was a habit of him doing this in the past, in other words, if he had been an adulterer and he had a habit of inviting women to be alone with them for the purpose of adultery, then yes, we could conclude based on his past. But there is no record of him having an adulterous affair. There is no pattern that was there that this is his mode of operation. So we cannot conclude just simply because he wanted to meet with a woman alone that he wanted to have sex with her at some hotel or someplace and have an adulterous affair. We can't conclude that. So that's a no-no. We cannot conclude that. And so we have to stop slandering Michael Brown. Now, it may come out. I don't know what this investigation will show. All I do know is, as Christians, we cannot slander someone and besmirch their name just based on what we might think or feel or some hunch we have is like, well, there's definitely only one reason why he would want to meet with this woman alone, and that is to have an adulterous affair. No, there are all kinds of reasons why he might want to meet with this woman alone. I don't know the whole context. I don't know if this relationship started with her sharing with Michael Brown, this pastor, Michael Brown leader, that she was having marital problems and wanted to talk with him and about her and her husband's relationship or whatever. I don't know the whole context, and neither do these people who are speculating. And so it's not fair to make conclusions that the evidence does not support. So we have to be fair. We have to be objective. We have to not allow our anger and resentment and really anger toward Michael Brown's covering this up for these years to spill over and thinking the worst of him. And I think that's what some of these people are doing when they hear about Michael Brown. They're so disappointed in him that he would be such a hypocrite in telling these students at this fire school 20 years ago that it's so important that they be pure and holy, and to not even do things like, if their boyfriend and girlfriend, hold hands in public at the school or show any public displays of affection at the school, and be very strict in this purity atmosphere. And then on the other hand, being real loose and careless with his friendships and relationships with the opposite sex and crossing boundaries all the time. It's hypocritical. There's no question about it. And it needed to be brought out, I think, publicly at the time instead of kept under wraps to protect Michael Brown's reputation as a leader, or not embarrass him, or not show him to be hypocritical, just to protect him and his work and ministry. So he decided, well, I'm just going to try to do damage control and minimize everything, and that will deal with this situation. Well, he thought that was dealt with 20-some years ago, but evidently it wasn't dealt with, and now he's reaping the negative consequences of it. But another thing you have to also ask the question, is it fair to have these people who, some of them knew about this inappropriate crossing the line relationship that Michael Brown was involved in, is it fair for them to come back after 2 decades and try to dig up this whole thing again? Is it fair under the circumstances of the offenses? For example, if you look at what we know about the offenses here, while totally hypocritical and totally inappropriate, and definitely some form of misconduct on Brown's part, these charges that we know about and the evidence supports are relatively minor in the whole scope of what we're used to in these scandals. And so, for example, it's not fair to make parallels between, there was this other big charismatic Pentecostal leader scandal down in Kansas City, Mike Bickle. He was actually committing adultery. He was actually a sexual abuser, no question about it. He was actually grooming these girls for a sexual relationship. This was really wrong, and this was really bad. And there's no question about it, because the evidence all points to that. But there are people online that are saying, well, Michael Brown knew Mike Bickle, was friends of Mike Bickle, and so his situation is the same. It's a parallel. And I'm thinking, wait, that is totally inappropriate to make that a parallel situation. These are 2 individuals and 2 different situations. And what you're doing is called guilt by association. You're saying, well, just as Mike Bickle was found guilty of sexual abuse, so too Michael Brown should be found guilty of sexual abuse because they were either friends or they were colleagues or whatever. They knew each other. That is not valid. You have to look at each situation on its own and look at its own evidence. You can't say because Mike Bickle was guilty of this, so is Michael Brown guilty of the same thing. No, that's totally invalid. But this raises a question. Why are people coming after Michael Brown after 20 years, especially the young woman? Now, the young woman she's saying she was a victim, which doesn't really make a lot of sense if she was actually part of that whole problem and she was crossing boundaries, she was crossing lines, she was acting inappropriately, she had agency, she had free will, she didn't have to be there, she was there, she made a choice. And some people say, well, it's because of the power differential. Brown was in a position of authority and she wasn't. Well, there's also the side, what about, say, in the book of Proverbs, it talks about the seductress who tempts young men. And Proverbs talks about men have to be willing to resist the temptress and the seductress. And that brings up the fact that a lot of the women don't realize that they have power. They have the sexual attraction power, and they can use that as a weapon. And so to not factor in that and to say, well, all these women are just victims. No, that's not true. Especially the older middle-aged woman. It's not a situation where Brown has got all this power and they don't have any. The middle-aged woman definitely probably had some kind of attractive power, and the younger woman definitely had attractive power. Even just maybe having this younger woman around made Brown built up his ego and thought he made him feel good about himself to have a younger woman around him and working with him and whatever. But this, just because Brown had an authority situation and was the leader of this ministry, doesn't mean that these women are victims. But why would you come back? Why would this younger woman come back and now want to claim that Brown did something wrong when they already confronted this? And why would she want to bring up an embarrassing moment in her life and bring all of those problems and feelings up again a second time? The point being that we as Christians, we have to look at the evidence, we have to be objective and not let our own subjective anger, resentment, mad at Michael Brown or all these emotions sway. We need to let the facts speak where they are, think clearly about these things, and not jump to conclusions. So I hope that's a helpful warning for a lot of people in dealing with fallen leaders. See you back next week. God bless.